Joining us now in the Cipher Brief studio is Mark Montgomery, the former executive director of the Cyberspace Solarium Commission. And Mark, you continue to keep your hands very deep into these pots of what's happening in the world. And you're in probably one of the most consequential places right now when it comes to understanding cyber attacks, and that is Taiwan. So I want to thank you so much for joining us today from Taiwan.
Well, thank you for having me, Susan.
You've been meeting with senior leaders there, Mark, since you arrived. I want to get just a sense right off the top. What's top of mind for them right now?
Well, for sure, it's been President Trump's comments on Ukraine and his kind of treatment of the negotiation process. As you may know, the the Taiwan government has repeatedly said that continued success in Ukraine is good for Taiwan. I mean, they understand basic deterrence that if you want to deter one bully, standing up to the other bully in the neighborhood, particularly when they're all aligned in an axis of authoritarians, is important. And backing down to that bully or appeasing that bully will probably get Taiwan thinks that'll embolden China to do things to them. So there's a lot of nerves here about how to handle that, and then there's broader nerves on how to handle President Trump and his approach to Taiwan and China.
Can we just reset for everybody? I mean, it's been such just a dizzying few weeks, and there's so much to focus on. It's hard to stay focused. Taiwan has been really critical part of U.S. policy and sort of putting up the defenses when it comes to China's intention to make Taiwan once again part of mainland China. Remind us once again, Mark, why is Taiwan so important to the U.S.?
Sure. So, I mean, there's a few reasons. I mean, the original reason back in the 1979, there was an agreement, after we had switched allegiances to who was at the UN, who would be, China as we saw it with, to the mainland. After Kissinger did that, the Congress did respond eventually with the Taiwan Relations Act, which defined and said, look, the United States is going to make sure Taiwan is not compelled to be absorbed into China. And then it said, hey, to do that, we'll support you selling weapons, and the United States will have plans for how they would support you if necessary. And that made perfect sense. I mean, if you go back to when I was a young kid, I mean, we had 10,000 troops in Taiwan. I mean, we had troops in Taiwan all the way up to about 1979, and the numbers were in the thousands through the end of the Vietnam War. So, I mean, this was a long-standing ally. So the first reason Taiwan matters is that our values. We had said to them, we will protect you against being, compelled or coerced into back into mainland China without an agreement by you. That's the first reason. Since then, well, Taiwan's evolved. As they shed their military coup, their military martial law around 1987, and democracy came to Taiwan. Capitalism came with it, and they flourished. And eventually, and they invested in TSMC, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation. They did not steal it from the United States, as President Trump on occasion implies. But Morris, set the company up here in Taiwan and has been highly successful. Fast forward, they're now just a critical element of the global economy. It's not just that their GDPs, some chunk of that, it is pretty small. It's that they facilitate the GDP of the United States, of China to some degree, and other countries around the world with the work of not just TSMC, but UMC and other semiconductor manufacturing equipment companies here. But they certainly are the drivers in logic chips and the later generation logic chips of like 357 nanometer.
And these are the chips and the semiconductors and the chips that are basically used in almost everything that we consume today, whether it's cars
They're
or
used in
phones.
almost everything like this, everything
Yeah,
small, and in your kids, Xbox, you know,
yeah,
my LRASM and Harpoon missiles in the backyard. They can use legacy. They use legacy chips, believe it or not.
yeah.
The military is actually a little slower, but the computer underneath your next to your feet in your F-150 truck or in your in your car is full of TSMC chips.
Yeah.
And then, of course, in the end, they do a lot of the NVIDIA chips that drive the AI and data center kind of computational power that we see.
The future of national security is here. Introducing the Cipher Brief's NatSec Edge Conference, June 5th through 6th, 2025 in Austin, Texas. Join leaders from intelligence, defense, private industry, and investment as they explore the innovations shaping tomorrow's world. Gain critical insights, connect with top minds, and shape the future of security in an interconnected world. Don't just witness the future, be a part of it. Secure your spot now at natsekedge.com.
You know, one of the things you mentioned, Ukraine, right off the top, one of the things in Ukraine that was very concerning early on for the United States and people like you who have incredible expertise in cyber was that Russia had used Ukraine as almost a test bed for cyber attacks. When we look now at Taiwan, exactly where you're sitting as we're talking, there have been, well, according to the National Security Bureau of Taiwan, attacks that were sponsored by the Chinese government have doubled in 2024 to more than 2.4 million a day against government entities in Taiwan. Mark, just like give us a sense of how they're coping with this and how they're planning for their own defense if there is more of an aggressive action in terms of bringing Taiwan back into China.
So first, I would say that's probably slightly less than the number that attack the U.S. Pentagon each day, but it's still a big number. But I want to separate two things because you brought up a great point. What's the threat from China? I'm not sure it's those kind of distributed denial of service or those kind of like pinging attacks that are just kind of checking out, mapping surfaces. I'm much more worried about their successful penetrations of networks and then their installation of malware to come back at a later date and conduct destructive or disruptive behavior. In the United States, we called that Operation Volt Typhoon, named after the Advanced Persistent Threat Team from China that did it. And I'll just say that if China's screwing with our critical infrastructure, to X degree, they're screwing to the Japanese critical infrastructure to 2X and the Taiwan infrastructure to 5X. So almost as bothering as the big numbers you mentioned for those broader attacks is the specific directed attacks against their infrastructure. And it is pervasive, comprehensive, and persistent. Every other adverb I can pull out, it's that. Or verb I can pull out, it's that. So my point is that the Chinese are really in there. They're working it hard. The Taiwan struggle with this. They're like us. They're a democracy. And they have a lot of their critical infrastructure is run by by private industry. Now, in their private industry, there's one power company, not the 7 or 8 big ones that are in the United States, and one big telecom company. So it's a little different, but it's still the private sector, and they still have a lot of work to do to get together to secure all these networks that we've been talking about. So the short answer is it's a big deal that Taiwan's getting attacked like this, and they're really not ready for it. And I think it's going to pressurize the situation during a crisis.
Gosh, so I mean, the first thing I think of obviously are what are the solutions here? What do you think? Who needs to step up and sort of help? Is it the U.S. government? Can you count on the U.S. government to do that right now with sort of the new administration? We're still trying to figure out kind of what the policy is toward Taiwan at the moment.
So I think it's a couple of things. So we do tabletop exercises with them where we look at cyber-enabled economic warfare. That's the mixing of financial attacks that could be cyber-based, but often are just like removal of access, tough love from Chinese banks to Taiwanese companies operating their company, or blocking of remittances. In addition, there's energy attacks. Again, they could be cyber, or they could be like a missile closure area around where LNG is delivered. And then finally, communications attacks. They could be cyber. They could be anchors being dropped on cables. So we looked at all of those and studied them, and it was tough. When done right, China was able to crank up the pressure just beneath where the U.S. would come and respond, or the Japanese or the Australians. They respond after us. So Taiwan was alone under severe pressure, and then and just kept it for 2, 3, 4 months, and eventually it breaks societal resilience. Mm-hmm. Now that's the good news is you do this tabletop and you start to say, well, what are actions we could have taken? What if we had this capability, that capability? You start to identify them, and then you say, these are 10 or 15 things we can do before an event, 2 to 3 years before an event to be better prepared. Here's 5 or 6 things we can do at the initiation of an event to be more resilient and recoverable. And then here's the 5 or 6 things we can do in recovery, but it's good to have practiced them so we're more efficient and effective. So now you have a list of like 15 to 20 things that need to be done. And here's what's unique. It's not all Taiwan homework. Some of it's the United States. And I'll give you one example quickly is that if they do a virtual closure area or some kind of cyber attack that takes out LNG, and we've got to bring in LNG shipping, and they're running like this virtual, basically, quarantine around Taiwan, we may need to reflag the ships, U.S., and escort them in like we did with Kuwait during the
This is
tanker wars.
liquefied natural gas is
That's right,
LNG. Yeah.
LNG, liquefied natural gas. And so in this case, well, we've got to study where's the LNG coming from. Are there countries that are favorable to doing this kind of reflagging? It's mostly Australia, U.S., but also Qatar. Maybe not.
Mm-hmm.
Are they getting the LNG from the right countries? Can they align themselves to more countries guaranteed to be friendly? There's all these things they can do that make it so that when the cyber attack happens, it has less impact.
Mm-hmm.
But those are things you got to do, and you got to practice. You can't just, let me just tell you what the lawyer gaggle will be like if you try to put this together for the first time in the middle of the crisis. There's going to be 100 reasons you hear no. Well, I'd like to hear them all ahead of time during a practice event, 3 months or 6 months or 9 months ahead of time, work my way through all the no's, squash all the beef, and then, be ready to do that kind of exercise or operation when a real crisis happens.
Yeah, I'm not sure that everybody is really tracking, just broadly among readers, viewers, the fact that China and Russia both have been in U.S. critical infrastructure for years, and that there are deep concerns about what they're able to do there. And so when you talk about the effects on Japan and then on Taiwan, I think it's very understandable why this is so concerning. You just wrote a piece not long ago in the Cipher Brief, Mark, that we published about Volt Typhoon and the suspected targeting of critical infrastructure in Guam. Kind of a big deal because Guam is really essential to U.S. Navy operations in the Pacific. Talk to us a little bit more about why that's such a top issue for you as well.
So this is one of the areas where we've revealed it. So we've revealed Guam, Hawaii, a little bit of the West Coast. I'll just, gently point out that China has a map. They probably hit the Midwest and the East Coast as well. Just for whatever reason, we chose not to reveal it. We also listed certain infrastructures, but didn't list others. I suspect they hit almost all of them. But to reset ourselves for Guam, Guam is a critical node for Indo-PACOM's warfighting capability, both naval and air, which is pretty important in an air maritime campaign. But all the services are there. The Navy's got submarines there, critical submarines that have to be able to get underway, get out, and carry out the fight, come back in, reload, go back out. The Air Force operates a magnificently large airfield at Anderson, where they can fly from. The Army guards it with THAAD, and then which is a theater air defense system. And then the Marines are moving into Guam because years ago we made a deal to trim the size of our Marine Corps in Okinawa and move them to Guam, slightly out of the missile range of Japan. The missile range is caught up, and Guam's in it as well. But what I would say here is Guam has to be defended. And one of the most, not surprising to people like me who write war plans, an area where the Chinese had really worked over our critical infrastructure was Guam. And it was in the communications networks and other networks. And clearly their goal was to bring the critical infrastructure, the critical assets within Guam's critical infrastructure to their knees during a crisis by having disruptive or destructive events occur during a crisis or casualty. Hitting these forward deployed forces is a big deal. And it's even, I talk a lot about the military mobility and the stuff back in CONUS, being able to come out. Well, it's even a bigger deal if you can't receive it and your forces that are out there are kind of trapped or limited because the Guam infrastructure doesn't work. And I would say this applies to both Japan, maybe the Philippines, and Taiwan. The countries that we have to fight with and through, and Australia, the countries that we have to fight with and through have to have critical infrastructure at the same high quality as ours, because we want our forces to be able to seamlessly fight with and through those countries' infrastructures.
Yeah, Mark, I want to give a little bit of a shameless plug here for the Cyber Initiatives Group, which, of course, you're a principal member of this group, and an upcoming summit that is available for free. It's virtual, coming up in March. And if you want details on that, you can find out more at cyberinitiativesgroup.com. But I think we should continue this conversation during that SIG summit as well. So what's next for you while you're in Taiwan now?
The Halifax Taipei conference, security conference, which is nice. Halifax, John McCain, who I worked for, loved Halifax. He loved Taiwan. I can't think of a more important security conference to have come to Taiwan and kind of work it. Prime Minister Abe, Shinzo Abe, the late Prime Minister of Japan, his wife was here. Because he had a strong connection to Taiwan and tried hard to push Japan's relationship and successfully to recognize that a threat to Taiwan is an existential threat to Japan, the Chinese threat. And so it's great to see the United States and Japan kind of talking about how to think about this problem here. And I thought Halifax did a great job so far carrying it off.
Yeah. Mark Montgomery, former executive director of the Cyberspace Solarium Commission, obviously a principal member of the Cyber Initiatives Group. I want to thank you for taking a few minutes to share some ground truth from Taiwan with us here at the Cipher Brief. It's good to see you.
Thank you for having me, Suzanne.